Welcome again to Newcastle Family History Society podcasts. The Newcastle Family History Society, located on Awabakal land in Newcastle, New South Wales, Australia, provides support for those interested in family history. This, the second in the occasional series about notable women who lived and worked in Newcastle and the Hunter Valley, is an audio extraction from the Society's February 2024 presentation by Dr. Jude Conway. Sit back and listen to the life of the beloved physician, Dr. Ethel Byrne.
I'd like to introduce Dr. Jude Conway. Jude has been doing some wonderful work on researching the notable women in Newcastle, from Newcastle. Women that we really should know about. And sadly, in many instances, we don't know about them for one reason or another. But Jude's making sure that that is rectified now. And we're kind of hoping this might be a regular event at the beginning of each year.
I've got hundreds.
Because there are so many of them.
Yes.
Yeah. But I would like to introduce Jude and say how very pleased we are to welcome you and to hear what you have to say tonight.
Thanks, Mel. I'd like to also pay my respects to Awabakal elders past and present, as we're on unceded Awabakal land. And I would also like to thank Dr. Ross Kerridge, who's been giving me input into for my research into Dr. Ethel Byrne. Now, as was pointed out in a 1988 letter to the Newcastle Herald, the many names associated with the Royal Newcastle Hospital, like York, Nixon, McCaffrey, William Lyne, Madison, were all good men. However, women also shouldered responsibilities in the hospital, and tonight I am talking about one of those women. Now, Ethel Byrne was born in 1895, halfway between Wagga and Albury, in a small community called Cookadinia, and that was an Aboriginal word meaning kookaburra. She was the 9th child of 10 of a country school teacher, James Byrne, and Margaret Crennan Byrne. Both had been born in New South Wales themselves. 2 years later, the family moved to Carabubula, near Werris Creek. Yes, near Werris Creek, where the children had perfect freedom in hilly scrub country, climbing around in search of ferns and wildflowers. Ethel was educated at Carabubula School, public school, where her father taught, and then, aged about 12 or 13, would have caught the train 30 kilometres to Corindi, to the Corindi Superior Public School, to get her qualifying certificate in order to attend Maitland Girls High School, where she was fortunate to be a student under the legendary and popular Janet Grossman. Ethel boarded there for 2 years, and then in late 1911, her family moved to Largs, where they lived surrounded by fields of lucerne, millet and corn. Culture abounded in the Byrne home. Ethel's had a favourite poet, Alfred Lord Tennyson, and she learned The Lady of Shalott, which I think is quite long. She learned it off by heart. She loved reading and music, and at 15, Chopin's Funeral March was positively the most beautiful thing she'd ever heard. Her favourite subjects were Latin and botany, which was the only science subject, by the way, she ever studied at school, though she was fascinated by radium and electricity, which already is marking her as a bit unusual. She did not do especially well in the junior public exams. Her only A was in English, and she got a B in botany and C's in all her other subjects. But Ethel's parents encouraged all their daughters, and there was 5 or 6 of them, as well as their sons, to go on to higher education. So Ethel went on to the Leaving Certificate in 1913, and she must have studied harder because she got honours in Latin and botany, an A in history, and B's in Maths 1 and Maths 2, French and English. Now, those results were good enough for her to win a bursary and an exhibition to the University of Sydney to study medicine. Through that, she received free education, £5 a year for her textbooks, and £50 a year to live away from home. Ethel passed all the subjects at uni, including physics, which I was impressed with, given her lack of previous science, but she had studied maths. In 1917, she was selected as one of only 2 fourth-year medical students to work in the pathology department at Royal Prince Alfred Hospital. Of course, the call-up of men for World War I had depleted their staff. After only a few days there, the other student asked Ethel to run over the equipment she would take on a tray to the wards. Ethel's reply was courage, kindness, red cell fluid, white cell fluid, and pipettes. And that answer was an early indication of her lifelong approach to medicine. Now, on the 1st of October 1918, Ethel Byrne was awarded her Bachelor of Medicine, and she and another female graduate joined the staff of Newcastle Hospital. So she joined the staff as a junior resident medical officer and RMO. And by the way, don't forget that Newcastle Hospital only became Royal Newcastle Hospital in 1949. So I'll be referring it in early years to as Newcastle Hospital. Now, Ethel and the other woman were the first female doctors there, undoubtedly recruited because of the shortage of men due to war. And they were accommodated in the Great Northern Hotel because until the never before needed lady doctors' quarters were completed. They had to be specially made for them. Before a fortnight had passed, in a newspaper bereavement notice, Dr. Byrne was given sincere thanks for her kindness she had shown to the late person in hospital. Now, Ethel was thrown into the deep end with the 1919 arrival of the deadly influenza epidemic. She worked long hours and performed thousands of inoculations. At its height, she was often the only RMO on duty. When the medical superintendent himself had to go into isolation, she even became acting superintendent, as well as her doctorly duties that involved having an overview of patient numbers in each department and problems, and reporting these to the hospital board every week. The Newcastle Sun was stunned. "Lady assumes control," it shouted in capital letters. In June, because of her added responsibilities, Ethel applied for a salary to be raised to £400. In response, the board recommended £300. At the following meeting, another doctor argued, "The only grounds on which I can see that the increase to Dr. Byrne could be refused is that she is a woman. She has done good work here and a tremendous lot of it." He was obviously an influential doctor. It was then resolved to increase Dr. Byrne's salary to £400. By late July, however, there was a new medical superintendent, and I like this, Ethel was given a weekend off to go to Sydney. Now, after completing her 2-year residency, Ethel chose to specialise in pathology, initially at the hospital, but by April 1922, she had established her own private practice with rooms in Tyrrell House and a fully equipped laboratory. Within 6 years, Dr. Ethel Byrne was being described as one of the best in the district for pathological work. To increase her expertise, in 1929, she travelled to Great Britain and Europe for a year to learn more about diseases. The whole time Ethel kept a connection with Newcastle Hospital, however, as the honorary pathologist, remaining in that role for 25 years. She often rendered extra services as there was a rapid turnover in the hospital pathologists, I don't know why, and heavy demands from epidemics in those years. After the 1932 diphtheria epidemic, the hospital board praised the valuable and zealous work of Ethel and Novocastrian-born Dr. Ruby Everidge, the resident pathologist at the time. The pair wrote a paper entitled Some Useful Tests in the Diagnosis of Common Clinical Conditions, and they listed all the yuck stuff they had to test: urine, blood, feces, spinal fluid, sputum. That was pathology work. They read their paper to a meeting of the Central Northern Medical Association and published it in the Medical Journal of Australia in 1933, already showing that she was a thinking doctor and an analytical doctor. Also in those years, there was an outbreak of poliomyelitis, and Ethel became the Newcastle representative of the Infantile Paralysis Committee. On one occasion, when her appeal for serum for the treatment of an urgent case was broadcast from Sydney radio station 2FC, some serum was located, but as no plane was available, an official from the New Guard, which I think you have all heard of, who caused trouble at the opening of the Sydney Harbour Bridge, volunteered to transport it to Newcastle by car. And there was even no delay at the Hawkesbury River because the punch operator had been phoned in advance to keep the punch ready. So she had some clout. In 1937, Newcastle Hospital established a Sister Kenny clinic for paralysis, which focused on hot water therapy, massage, and movement of the legs. 2 years later, the hospital medical superintendent, he didn't like Sister Kenny and he dropped her as a consultant, saying her methods could not replace splinting of limbs, although keeping some of her suggestions. Another polio epidemic in Newcastle in 1950 and 51 was reviewed by doctors Ethel Byrne and Alan Roberts in the Medical Journal. Many years ago, they wrote, in the splinting era, we were much impressed by the principles of Miss Elizabeth Kenny's treatment, which were quickly absorbed into the Newcastle Hospital's physiotherapy department, that have not yet manifested to any extent in the capital cities of Australia. You may know that Sister Kenny had already been very influential in America by this time. The editors of the journal thought that the Burns and Roberts support for Kenny's methods was an unusual point of view, which would give rise to some comment. Now, over the years, Ethel became pathologist to most coalfields, visiting pathologist to most coalfields hospitals. Brentwood Hospital in Muswell was thankful that she assisted with tests at her laboratory in cases of urgency, while Cessnock Hospital noted that Dr. Byrne not only called there every week, but would come at any time required to carry out blood transfusions, etc. She is presumed to be the first woman doctor to be employed by Maitland Hospital when she was appointed visiting pathologist there in 1938. So she may well have been the first woman doctor at those other coalfields hospitals as well. Now, as well as not many women doctors in those years, there are also not many women driving or owning cars. But Ethel had to cover many miles in the course of her work, so she drove her own car. Now, Ethel, as a pathologist, she often gave evidence in court, re-injuries and causes of death, because she used to do autopsies. In the case of miners, giving a more independent opinion than the doctors employed by the mining companies, like Newcastle's first ever woman doctor, May Harris, who would assert a healthy man need not fear coal dust. Both women had the distressing task of examining two decomposed bodies from the 1923 Bellbird colliery disaster, which had only been recovered a year after that accident. Ethel also gave evidence in 1934 in a court case about an accomplished young horsewoman from Dungog who probably committed suicide after having an illegal abortion. The Truth newspaper, which luridly covered the case, described Dr. Byrne as the well-known Newcastle blood specialist. And Ethel was becoming well-known, or perhaps widely connected would be a better term, or influential. Even back in 1924, when the Deputy Medical Superintendent of Newcastle Hospital brought the Klein test for syphilis back from the US, and the hospital, our hospital pathology department, was the first in Australia to introduce it. Dr. Byrne was so impressed with its practicality that she was influential in introducing it into many laboratories throughout Australia. She was also expanding her network by attending Australasian medical congresses. Now, philanthropist Dr. Lucy Gullett, with no obvious links to our city, left 2,000 books to Newcastle Library in her will in 1951. She lived in Sydney. And I always wondered why. On learning that they both attended a Victorian Medical Women's Society party after one of the medical congresses in Melbourne, I sort of imagined that Dr. Gullett learnt about the cultural poverty of Newcastle through Dr. Ethel Byrne. Now, Ethel never married, but she was very sociable. She attended the theatre, concerts, dances and cabarets, for some reason often favouring a black dress, maybe a serious woman, and loved bridge evenings for good causes. She mixed with many familiar names in Newcastle's history: the Wansies, Rankins, Merriweathers, Saddingtons, Woods, Lysarts, Wynns, Hannells. She had friends and relatives stay, and in return she stayed with them in Sydney, Southern Highlands, Orange, Launceston. She especially spent time with her younger sister Lorna, who was one of the first women to graduate in agriculture from Sydney Uni and gained fame as the organiser for women for the New South Wales Agricultural Bureau and broadcasting the Country Women's Session on ABC Radio. Because Lorna did not marry until she was 50, the two sisters often went away together on holidays. Now, when Ethel had resigned as hospital pathologist in 1922, she had to move out of the lady doctor's quarters and was soon living at number 7 in what was then called Military Road Extended, Newcastle East, and is now known as Stevenson Place. But by 1940, having become better off, she upsized to 30 Terrace Street, that is the terrace on the hill. Now, those of you who receive the Family History Society newsletter will be wondering about Ethel's connection with TB sufferers. So I'll now elaborate on that. Tuberculosis is a contagious bacterial disease that especially affects the lungs and is transmitted by sufferers' coughs, which are wet coughs, the droplets in their coughs. Now, at the beginning of the 20th century, I think we forget these days, TB, then commonly often known as consumption or even the White Plague, was a major cause of death in Australia. It was number 1 cause for females and number 2 cause for men. It is more common when poverty forces people to live in overcrowded conditions. And in those years, Newcastle had more poverty than New South Wales average. A chest clinic maintained by the New South Wales Department of Public Health was set up in Newcastle by 1915. In the 1920s, it was in King Street and under the direction of the aforementioned Dr. May Harris. Now, in the mid-1920s, Ethel became the clinic doctor and remained so for 35 years. In 1933, a decision was made that the clinic be absorbed into the Newcastle Hospital Outpatients Department, while the Department of Public Health would continue to pay Ethel £100 a year for what was a part-time job. But it could not actually be fit into the hospital until a new outpatients block was opened in July 1934. Now, that block used the corner of King and Pacific Street. Some of you may have been into that block. I'm pretty sure I did many decades ago. Now, a friend of my mother's, Claire Rook, who wrote the 1988 letter to the Herald, she had a shocking chest all her life, and she recalled hours of waiting at that clinic on a Thursday night in the 1930s because of the long lines of people with chest problems. And of course, as well as TB, respiratory issues were rife in our heavily polluted industrial city. To give you some ideas of numbers, in 1937, there were 3,018 attendances at the clinic. Claire remembered that the clinic sister was as efficient as Dr. Byrne was gentle. And Claire always left with a free bottle of cough mixture under one arm and Scott's emulsion under the other, which obviously was cod liver oil flavoured to try and make it taste a bit better. Now, Dr. Byrne generously kept rolls of cotton material in her office to give away to impoverished families, of which Claire's was at that time. The doctor, she told Claire to pick out 6 different designs, and then she cut off enough material for Claire's mother to make 6 dresses. One of the designs was navy blue with white polka dots. And never forgetting Dr. Byrne's kindness, that colour combination would rip her throat whenever she saw it for the rest of her life. So that's what she said. Now, a few of you knew of Vera Deakin, and in the Depression, her father became thin and weak and developed a cough, which became the dreaded spot on the lung, the X-ray, and he had to spend a long time in hospital with TB. It was the treatment by Dr. Ethel Byrne, which brought about his slow recovery. And after he came home, he continued to swallow all of her oils and emulsions until he was well enough to earn a living again. Now, when the Infectious Diseases Hospital in Waratah was ready in 1938, instead of Newcastle Hospital verandas, the TB patients were sent there for medical and surgical treatment. But after the Japanese shelled Newcastle in June 1942, the hospital was instructed by the government to keep a certain number of beds vacant for use in an emergency. So 10 TB patients at Waratah were asked to leave, or ordered to leave, I'd say. 2 went to a sanatorium in Sydney, the others went home, which did actually draw an irate letter to the Newcastle Herald. To make up for this, the clinic sister visited them regularly, and Ethel called in as frequently as her time and petrol rations permitted. In 1944, the New South Wales TB department pronounced Dr. Byrne's clinic, chest clinic, as one of the best in Australia. It was the only one which treated all patients free of charge, and that included x-rays, pathological investigations, as well as mixtures, emulsions, disinfectant, etc. If a patient was found to be tubercular, close relatives were advised to get examined regularly for years. And even when patients were discharged, they continued to report periodically for observation. Ethel came to know all her patients and their families very well, and she remembered everyone's names and their circumstances and would leave no stone unturned, this is a quote, to help them. Now, after the Pearl Harbor attack, the hospital board had arranged for an emergency hospital to be built on land they had bought at New Lantern Heights. And in 1943, a decision was made that it would become a chest hospital after the war. Probably already planning to be involved, that year Ethel studied for and passed the exam to gain membership of the Royal Australasian College of Physicians. One of her colleagues believed that her previous experience as a clinical pathologist played no small part in making her the sound physician that she became. So in June 1947, a modern hospital solely devoted to the treatment of TB sufferers opened, and Dr. Ethel Byrne was the sole physician, earning £1,000 a year. The land was renamed Rankin Park after the hospital board chairman. So every day Ethel did her rounds before 8 a.m. and again late at night. She would draw a little blood from the patients and use her glass pipette to check if their red blood cell count was improving, because they often got anemic. She had, as we know, a prodigious memory and for detail, and without even needing to read their files, because she'd probably written it in and she remembered everything, she would refer them for medical or surgical treatment and occupational therapy suitable for their condition. In addition, there was a very big outpatient clinic at Rankin Park, as well as the one in the city. So Ethel worked long hours and was continually on call. She also read what mattered in the literature and picked up extra medical pointers from conversations throughout the day with her many colleagues. All of them became her friends, and she always remembered their birthdays, even the young RMOs. Although she was notoriously camera shy, I have tracked down a small number of photos of Ethel, but only one of her at work. That photo, which Dr. Ross Kerridge sent me, was labelled 1954 Death Meeting. Now, I contacted Ross and said, "Oh, who's dead?" And he thought that was hilarious because it wasn't. They were held every week. The innovator, medical superintendent by now, was Dr. Chris McCarthy, and he was a great innovator. And one of his innovations was what were known as death meetings. They were held every Thursday at 4 p.m. in the Nixon Wing Lecture Theatre to discuss what treatment had been given to two people who had died during the week. One doctor described it as a powerful mechanism for peer review. And according to Ross Kerridge, that was a lot of doctors actually thought that was a bit socialist or communist at the time, sharing, people sharing views about what should have happened and what could have happened, how the treatment could have been better. Now, full-time staff doctors were expected to attend. And I imagine, as an experienced pathologist, Ethel would have always contributed to the discussion. Now, in the 1950s, Rankin Park began training RMOs, and one who started there in 1954 was Bill Cummings. And I spoke to him on the phone, and he reminisced how good Dr. Byrne was to work for, because she was good at her job, precise, dedicated, kind, and considerate. All the young doctors liked her. he said she was an absolute lady. Now, back in 1947, streptomycin, the first effective antibiotic used to treat TB, arrived in Australia. But the TB bacteria soon began developing a resistance. In the early 50s, studies showed that resistance could be prevented by the use of 2 or more different antibiotics. Now, at that point, Rankin Park doctors still had to apply for it. They couldn't just prescribe antibiotics. They had to get permission from the hospital because there were still restrictions on availability. But because of their effectiveness, surgical treatment, which had been a form of treatment used throughout the first half of the century, was phased out by 1955. Now, in 1956, the New South Wales Director of TB suggested that Dr. Byrne travel to Canada, the US, and Great Britain to study the latest developments in TB treatment, with the cost to be financed from the Commonwealth, which was, quite a good thing for the state government to suggest, but the Commonwealth agreed. The chairman of the hospital board thought that the hospital, as well as Dr. Byrne, was honoured by the invitation. So after spending a busy year overseas, Ethel returned in August 56, reporting what she had found to the various authorities. And she was soon involved in a new project at Rankin Park and obtaining funding for the construction of a small building adjacent to the Rankin Park Hospital, which provided single room accommodation for 12 male TB patients, a hall and woodworking machines for rehabilitation. And it was named Byrne House in her honour. Now, in early 1957, Ethel became ill. With what, I don't know. But she remained on call to all of her patients and seemingly drove herself to the point of collapse. Dr. Ethel Byrne died on the 5th of November that year, and her death certificate says she died of gastroenteritis complicated by methemoglobin at Royal Newcastle Hospital, of course, is where she was. She was only 62. Now, I believe methemoglobin can be caused by taking potassium chloride, which is an indication of her having taken her own life. If so, I can only assume that she was, whatever she had, she was in great pain. Ethel was cremated at a private funeral, and all her books were bequeathed to the nursing staff of Royal Newcastle and Rankin Park hospitals. So this was the death of a doctor who had endeared herself to many staff and thousands of patients. She had not just worked hard and efficiently, she was always compassionate and always had the welfare of her patients at heart. Dr. McCaffrey said that Dr. Byrne had wanted no sympathy for the amount of work she performed, and probably needed none, for she enjoyed all that she did. To many of her patients, her loss will be irreparable, he continued, for of her it could truly be said she was the beloved physician. Now, after her death, the combination antibiotics began curing TB very effectively, and the number of patients at Rankin Park Hospital dropped dramatically over the following years, and the hospital was gradually used for other treatments, and now, some of you may know, it's a rehabilitation hospital. I did go in 1974, I visited someone who had TB, so there were still people there in the 70s, but there's none there now. I'd just like to finish up with, so how was this beloved physician remembered? By the name of the tiny street, Byrne Hall Drive, on your right as you drive into the John Hunter Hospital. So look for it next time you go in. Byrne House is still there, but it is locked. And there is a memorial bird bath. Some older members of the community who were her patients remember her fondly, and one woman on Facebook said Dr. Byrne was her father's doctor, and because her parents thought the world of Dr. Byrne, they gave their son his middle name is Byrne, which I think is a lovely honour. Obscurely, there is a Wikipedia entry in German and fortunately an entry in English on the Australian Dictionary of Biography by the late Margaret Henry. Now, thanks for listening, and I hope you found Ethel as engaging as I do, and I'm happy to try and answer any questions as long as they're not too medical.
Thanks so much, Jude. That was absolutely wonderful.
We hope you enjoyed hearing about the life of Dr. Ethel Byrne, and we look forward to hearing more of Jude Conway's research into notable women of Newcastle and the Hunter Valley in the future. A complete version of this presentation, along with others given by our guest speakers, can be viewed on our YouTube channel. Thanks again for listening to Newcastle Family History Society podcasts.